art of PR, and I guess because you are you kind of are the number one these days, and how much that's changed in the last 40 odd years since you started, because the whole
Yeah.
landscape is completely different now. But does that change actually what you do?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's 50 years since I started really working for Keith Altham, so half a century, which is terrifying. I don't know about being the number one, but I'm certainly the longest serving PR now because I started before anyone else, I think. In one way, it's changed out of all imagination, and sometimes I feel like, I feel like the gatekeeper without offense. But in another way, I sometimes sit here and think, well, it's exactly the same. I look at a situation, I try and work out an angle. I mean, artists, clients will come to you with a really quite a boring story. They'll say, I've sold 1 million albums in Japan or something. You go, yeah, what's interesting? And I'll dig into their career and find out they're a Blackpool Rovers supporter and they nearly played for them once in the past or whatever it is. And and then I will use that as a platform to talk about the music or the whatever. So the actual skill, if you like, of being a PR, I find it's exactly the same because all that there's lots and lots of different platforms, and of course I'm on Instagram and on this, that, and the other. Um, but it's still about the narrative, and in some ways. This is a golden age for PR, I feel, because you can get to a lot of people very quickly. And also, it's a bit less structured. I mean, there was a period in the 90s, early 2000s where PR became very corporate and I thought very dull and very process driven and all about getting a press release right and all the rest of it. Now it's much more visual. It reminds me a bit more of fanzine punk type of period. Um, but weirdly, when I strip it all away, I find that the job that I do is pretty much the same. I come in and work up some stories and talk to a lot of people. And I still have always remained deliberately, in one way, old school, going and meeting people and having a drink with them and talking about music rather than, disseminating sort of thousands of emails or whatever and on an anonymous way. I just don't think that might be good mass communications, but I don't believe it's how music entertainment PR works anyway.
Is it about the overarching narrative, or is it about lots of cool little stories, or both?
Yeah, it's both, isn't it? Because I suppose if you've got an act, hypothetically, they've been away for 10, 15 years, they've been forgotten, they're coming back and they're doing a tour of stadiums. Well, that's the bigger story, isn't it? And there's a record. But really within it, what have you been doing and why is it going to be so good? And what's the new show look like? And what's the staging going to be like? And who's playing guitar? And what was the inspiration behind this new song? And why did you get back together? And so yeah, it's both. It's the big story, which is, I suppose, the headline, so and so come back, and then it's the different ones, which is a bit like a cake. I'll try and slice it up in lots of different ways, and one bit will work for the Telegraph, and one bit will work for Mojo, and one bit will work for, Louder Than War, and they're all. I never go on the one size fits all type of thing ever. So the headline might work for everybody, but the actual content, what the enemy want, is pretty different to what the Daily Star want. Or maybe it's not. I don't, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, yeah, so I do think a proper PR, it's my favorite part of the job actually, is sitting down and looking at it like a puzzle and figuring out all the bits that work. It's planning is everything.
I mean, a lot of this is in your book. I think your book's great, and it's a great insight into actually how pop culture works. Beyond PR and things. And I think what you do is you are a sort of backroom pop culture driver, aren't you? I mean, I know people like Mark McLaren, etc. Brilliant to
Yeah.
pop culture, and he's kind of put himself at the front of the whole thing. But it's actually guys like you sat in the background. They're actually creating the landscape, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean now you say it and I look back on it, that's absolutely the case. And I feel a lot of times I was at the crossroads or the center of everything. But at the time, it wasn't really a plan and it wasn't strategic. It just happened that way. So with punk, and by the way, I hold Malcolm McLaren in the highest esteem. I mean, what a fantastic communicator, entrepreneur, revolutionary, everything. I mean, and I learned everything a lot, whatever I could, I took from his skill. Um, But say with punk, I'd been trained by Keith Altham, who was like the doyen of old school PRs and, you know, obviously all of Woodstock and the Stones and the Who. So I knew Fleet Street and I knew what it was, which is all the old newspapers, and I knew the journalists, and I knew that, you know, I'd got to know people there, and it was all about having 10 pints of lager and talking about football, and you know, it was a different world. But then I didn't come into punk because I thought it was an opportunity. I was into punk before punk happened. I was waiting for punk. It was a natural thing for me. And because I'd been reviewing bands and pub rock scene, you know, so sort of Ian Drury, Kilburns, you know, Dr. Feelgood. Kind of was there when the 101ers started morphing into the Clash and the Guildford Stranglers became the Stranglers. So punk for me was a calling. I felt like it was almost like a religious experience. So I was very much with the bands and with the music, but I had this unique knowledge of the old school media. So I became this sort of connection point between the two unwittingly. So I'd get journalists calling up from the News of the World or the People or the Mirror or whatever, saying, "This terrifying, could you get us a word with the Damned?" Would you know, and they're kind of thinking it would be too scary. So I'd actually be the person that would manage to take them down to meet Jean-Jacques Bonnel or whatever it was. And because I knew JJ, I'd be able to persuade Jean-Jacques to turn on the charm for 5 minutes and give a good interview. So I was the bridge between the two worlds. And it's only when you look back in retrospect, was incredibly influential position. And as you say, it's you become a culture driver, and it happens again in the 90s with Spice and that. But it's only in reflection I can see that. But you are there at some of the moments in history, which is partly why I wrote the book. And I figured it when I was out on the road with the Stones, particularly in the early 80s. It was quite a lonely experience for me. I was a young one. I mean, most of the crew were American. You didn't have any social media, and I've been, I don't know, hotel in Dusseldorf on a Monday night, feeling quite lonely, really. I didn't have any team or anything with me. So I thought, hang on, but I am witnessing real culture, because the Stones were the first band to start playing stadiums. You still had that intense dynamic between Keith and Mick. They were still quite dangerous at that period. So that's when I started scribbling notes and putting on back of programs and things and building up a box. So the roots of the book go back to that, because I realized, yes, I kind of was a bit like Forrest Gump. I was sort of there, and there was a lot of important things happening.
So yeah, the intention to write the book itself goes back that far. That's that many decades, or is it just to
Well,
keep
it was the
track of your
intention.
life? Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't my life. It was to keep track of the lives, really, and keep track of culture. Although I wouldn't have thought of it like that then, and I wouldn't have used those words. And because I realized, I just felt I was seeing and hearing extraordinary things, and I thought somehow, some way in the future, this is almost of some historical significance. And I'd always been a collector of stuff as a kid. Very olden days, but we had scrapbooks and cut things out and put them in there. And I started with football. So I'd have all kinds of sort of things about Brighton or whatever, you know, and I'd have a picture of Jimmy Armfield or whatever, you know, all these things. And then that morphed into music. So for some reason, I was naturally interested in preserving stuff. And I kept a lot of that stuff and have done ever since. So I've got an archive with something like maybe as many as 5,000 items in it, bits and pieces, badges, letters, things. So I didn't really understand that I was an archivist or whatever, but somewhere within my DNA, I had this instinct about collecting and recording.
It's interesting you say that, because in a sense, when you talk about being an archivist, almost in a way, a PR is an archivist in current time, isn't it? You're actually creating the scrapbooks.
Yeah, and of course, I was privileged to live in, if you like, the end of the physical era. Of course, now it's digital. I mean, yes, we're still painting patterns and putting things, but it's harder to keep a record of it all. Now, I work off everything I do. I write down. So I work on desk diaries each day. I've got 50 years worth of them. For every single day, I can tell where I was and what I was doing. They're not the sort of diary where you get home and you say, I did this today and I did that. Because normally I'm too tired or whatever and it's too late to do it. But during the day, I'm writing it down. So I'll go back to a day in 1978 and it will say 10 o'clock, I don't know, meeting with Motorhead. Unbelievable that early in the morning. And then it'd be like 12 o'clock, the dentist or haircut or something. And then 4 o'clock, Marvin Gaye, who never showed up, whatever. And so each day, and I do it with lots of hieroglyphics and squiggles and things. And then I do piles of little notes. Even though I'm typing and everything's going out digitally, I've got a backup of scribbles where all the ideas and thoughts have come from. So I am archiving it literally. Today, a lot will have happened today. I'll have archived that.
Yeah, it's almost, if somebody could be bothered, it'd be great to scan all those and get them online.
Well, I try and scan them so that I've got a backup of them all anyway.
Yeah. So in your book, obviously there's great descriptions of people you work with. Super iconic, the people at the top of the game. But it's an interesting thing you just mentioned Stones there, because that jump, there's a jump there in there from, you start with the Who, of course, you're already in that kind of space, but it's the Punk, then to the Stones. Interesting kind of generational jump, size jump, a different type of band. I know they're rock and roll bands, but it's a different culture, it's a different band that comes a legacy. And great descriptions of how much in control they were in their, both Jagger and Richards in very different ways.
Yeah. Jagger and Richards, unbelievable control. By the way, I've just got to say, complete aside, and do forgive me, your voice there was reminding me of someone in the last few seconds, and I don't know if you got a mind. Sean Dyche.
Oh yeah, people say that now and then, yeah.
who I met, weirdly, a few months ago at a cult gig backstage at the Roundhouse. Great bloke. And we end up there at 1 a.m. Everyone's gone home. It's just me and Sean, and he wants to know all about the Pistols and the punk stuff. Great guy, really nice, actually. I sent him a good luck message when he left Everton the other day, but he sent a nice message. He said something like "C'est la vie" with a laugh. So yeah, maybe it was enough. But no,
So Jagger's Richards,
Jagger
yeah,
had an incredible control thing, and the way I got hired tells a lot about it. So Mick, I get flown out to New York, big deal in those days. I'm going to New York. You tell everyone for about a week before you go. And I'm interviewed. He's got an apartment in the Dakota buildings. It's a massive great room. The room is bigger than most of the venues that bands I'm working with are playing, And he sits me down. It's cool. And I sit down at a desk sort of thing, and he fires for about 45 minutes a volley of questions about the media, really detailed technical questions, and often very international. What publications in the Axel Springer group, what's the circulation for Il Messaggero and Rome. Really difficult stuff. And also a lot about the UK, who's the editor of the Daily Telegraph, what's the circulation at the Mail, endless. Who's the best up and coming writer on NME, which would have probably been Nick Kent or something then, and I sat there for 45 minutes. It was like sitting an O-level, and I didn't do very well at O-levels, but I went through it. And by then I'd had probably 7 or 8 years at least under my belt, going around in a van with the Stranglers and the Buzzcocks. So I sort of knew my stuff. So no, I thought that was it. I'd come back to London, and I get a call about a week later. I think I'm doing the Rolling Stones. I get a call from Keith, and I'm in the office in Edgware Road. Pick up the phone, 9 o'clock at night, and it's Keith. He says, "It's Keith here." He said, "Listen here, sonny boy Jim. If you want to work with the Rolling Stones, you just know I run this group, not that effing whatever. I won't say the words, Mick Jagger. And if you want to work with us, lad, you'll be down at Shepperton at midnight tonight to meet me." So I thought, what do I do? And I thought, I thought, I know where Mick Jagger's having dinner in Chelsea, Cheney Walk. So I go around to this restaurant, and I go in there, and I'm like a Dickensian figure, Oliver Twist at the back of the restaurant, and he's there fine dining type of thing, Italian restaurant. And I go up and tap to him and say, Mick, I've just had Keith on the phone, and he said, I'm not hired to do the Stones unless I come and meet him at midnight. And Mick just carries on him, and he looks over his shoulder, and he says, rather imperiously, he says, "Well, you better go then, betting you," and carries on eating. And And I thought, how do I get, I had no car. There was no such thing as an Addison Lee account. How do I get to Shepperton? Where is Shepperton? So I got a bus out to Ealing Broadway, and then I got another bus. Anyway, I get to Shepperton, and it was a rehearsal room, and I'm shown into this tiny room, absolutely tiny, I don't know, 10 foot, and it's a sort of kitchen with a broken window and a sink that doesn't work, nothing else. And Keith's minder, a lovely guy called Joe Seabrook, big, muscly guy with tattoos, he shows me, he says, wait here for Keith. So I stand there, there's not even a chair. Anyway, I stand there for an hour, nothing's happened. Then the background, I can hear, can't get no satisfaction, wafting in, stand there another hour, another hour. And when you're inside deep, you just sort of seeing where you go. Anyway, I've been standing there a long, long time, and I see the shafts of light, sunlight coming under the door. So I've stood there all night. I haven't even had a glass of water, And then suddenly the door sort of almost comes off its hinges, and in bursts Keith. And he looks more like the Johnny Depp character, the hair all over, the earrings a bit. And he says, right, I've got, and he starts asking me questions, and they're all about blues and reggae. And it's a lot of them about Johnny Cash, actually. What's Johnny Cash's third album? And then it's like, what's Howlin' Wolf's, live recording? Where's Gregory Isaacs' recording? I mean, it was like, again, really not easy stuff. But luckily, for me, especially reggae was an area I knew a lot about, I was a big fan of, but, blues and that. So again, I had 30 minutes of questions from Keith. Didn't mention business, media, nothing, just music. And then he walked out. And then I get a call about a week later from a guy called Prince Rupert Lowenstein, who is the business manager of the Stones. And he's a very nice chap. He said, would you like to come over to my office in St. James? So I go over, and it's an oak panelled office. And he's a really nice, quite a rotund chap in sort of, kind of city suit and tie and all the rest. He said, would you like a glass of sherry, old boy? And I said, yeah, I'll have a pint, actually, if you don't mind. And I'm offered a sherry. And he said, I remember he said, these Rolling Stones chaps quite like you. Would you like to be their public relations man? I said, yes. And he said, well, here you are, and I got given a check for about 150 quid or something, which, I mean, seemed all right then. And literally, that was it. But very, very, back to your question, and really, they're really smart people. They weren't mucking around.
But obviously, there's a tension in the band there. They're both wrestling for control, even when they're deciding who the PR is going to be. I mean, how do you deal with that as a PR in that kind of, for want of a better expression, across that crossfire hurricane?
It was so hard. I mean, if I had my time again, I would deal with it better. I mean, I hadn't really, I'd experienced some tension, like in the Stranglers between John and Hugh or whatever, or the Damned between Dave and Rat or whatever, but this was like another level for me. And I would be getting, they were not getting on well, and they were conducting their disputes through the media. And the front page of the newspapers a lot. So, there'd be a story about Keith, and then I'd get Mick on the phone saying, oh, can you get that story? Can you, this is what really happened, get a line, feed it to John Blake at the Sun, will you? So I'd call up John Blake at the Sun, he'd do front page, Mick says whatever. Then I'd get Keith to be on the phone. What's that fucking, you call that, call the Mirror. You call the Mirror and tell them I'm fucking pissed off about it, excuse my language or whatever. So this stuff was going on. And then on the touring, I got on well with Keith because I love music, So I would hang out with Keith a bit and really got that. And then Mick, I don't think liked it because he thought it was too much, it was too much Keith in the NME and not the Stones as a band, if you like. So then I'd get pulled Mick's way, and then Mick was going to do a solo tour, and I went on a promo tour just with Mick, and then I think, so it was like I was being pulled one way, pulled the other, and I wasn't experienced enough really. And even if I had been, I don't know if I'd have known how to. Very hard to handle that because this is like a medieval court, and they're the two kings, if you like, and they're almost not deliberately, but they're kind of playing with you in a way, or you're certainly in the middle of it. And it was really hard, and it kind of ended up having a nervous breakdown of sorts around that time, and probably all the stress and strain of that contributed. Not that anyone did it deliberately. So it's really difficult, but you get it in all, especially if we're talking rock and roll, you get it in all great bands, don't you? Jimmy and Robert, Pete and Roger, or Lennon and McCartney. It's part of what makes a great band, isn't it? That tension.
And is that part now, with the experience years later, is that something you bring to play? Would that even be your role? Because I think it used to be too old for males, but now thankfully it could be too old for women, can't it? Or probably the Spice Girls
Yeah,
is like
yeah.
that. So things have changed a lot, which is good. But if there was that thing where there were two people fighting for the spotlight, would you now, decades later, would you find that's kind of your role to say there's a better way of dealing with this situation, or is that nothing to do with your role?
Well, it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, I think if it was a situation like that now, I'd be trying to be, I mean, you're really trying to remain neutral. What you have to remember is you've been hired by the group. And I've got to be honest and say, look, in the group's best interest, maybe you shouldn't say or do that. But of course, that's very hard. And many a PR has come unstuck with that kind of situation because, on the one hand, you're just the person that puts out the stories, but on the other hand, you're a confidant, you're right in the inner circle. And if you say that something they don't like, you can get yourself fired. And that is really easy to get fired. And often you find without artists with big bands like that, they all have their own individual PRs. So I see the Eagles are touring next year. I don't know what they're like, but they might have 5 PRs, one for each of the people. And then you kind of have these sort of conferences where the
Yeah,
PRs come
yeah,
together and wow. I mean, with the Spice Girls, of course, there were 5 strong individuals there who were all great in different ways. And I not only represented the Spice Girls, at some time or another, I represented them all individually. I was even Victoria's manager at one point. And that was great. And mostly that worked well because everyone kind of had their own space. But you get some politics there, and you'd also get a competition for space because there would be only so many GQ or Esquire or Vogue covers. And of course, if it went to Mel B instead of Mel C, or it went to Baby instead of Sport, etc., etc., um, as a PR, you could be caught in the crossfire a lot. I mean, now I don't I mean, I work with, say, it's I'm working with an individual, like Youngblood's a good example. There is only Youngblood. I mean, there's his manager and Thomas and Adam, and they're all great. But you haven't got that tension with two people, sort of. I don't. I mean, I'm sure it'd be like that if we we're working for Oasis. But I don't. It's pretty unusual now. But I mean, sadly, both of you and I would agree with this. I guess we're not living in an era of great British world conquering rock and roll bands. Sadly, I would actually love to be in that position. I would love to a new band to sort of hire me, and I'd have to deal with all those headaches and draw on my experience.
yeah. I think pop culture now is about solo artists more than bands, and it's just the way people's attention spans can't go more than beyond one person, can they?
Yeah, and John, and it's very controlled, as you will know, especially if it goes through the system. Suddenly you're dealing with record companies. They're not like a record company around the corner you go and have a meeting with. They're probably based in California. You've probably got 30 or 40 people on email trails. It all gets very risk averse, very hard to put your hand up on email and say, "Oh, I think you're wrong. We should be doing this." So you end up very remote. I mean, I was acting for one really famous, I won't say it was a really famous pop star about 5 years ago, and I was given this missive: whatever happens, don't talk to them. And it's like, really?
Yeah.
So anyway, they did a launch at Hanover Square for an album launch, and I go to the toilet. There's a backstage toilet, and I'm standing there doing the bit, and I look next to me, and there's only 2 of us in the toilet, and it's the star. And I'm thinking, I better stay on message. So even though he's sort of like quite normal, I'm blanking him. I'm not saying
Yeah.
anything. And he's thinking, I'm a miserable sod. Who's this git? And I'm not allowed to say hello. And it's a shame. It's not like, going back to punk, but the Stranglers or Gen X or these bands, Tony and Billy, they just rock up to the office one day, and then we'd go around to Chrysalis and have a meeting with Roy Eldridge or something, and you decide what you were going to do there and then. And I think from a music point of view, it made for a lot more exciting and spontaneous stuff.
I know punk was a construct, and it's a fantastic construct. And for people my age, which is 63, it was an amazing time to be growing up, 15 or 16. But that kind of maverick spirit that was still in there, wasn't it? I mean, you as somebody who's grew up with punk as well, do you ever feel like
Yeah.
tearing the fabric a little bit now and then? Or is it just so controlled that you can't?
What now to tear the fabric? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Of course, I feel like it. I mean, I try to avoid going to these meetings because I think you sit around the table and there's about 40 people, and you'll get a 3-minute slot, and someone will say, "Oh, we've got great news. We're getting played on downtown radio Belfast," and then someone else will talk about what they're doing. So it'll finally get to your space, and all they really want to know is that you've got the front cover of Mojo and you've got a spread in whatever, Sunday Times Culture or The Guardian. And it's like, I'm going out of my mind with boredom. And I want to say, well, yeah, the whole campaign shit, you should drop that. You should, we should get the band arrested for having a punch up in a club. And, and if you come up with this sort of stuff. I was at a meeting before Christmas, one of the big labels, and someone was talking about a song and said, well, where did that song come about? I won't say the artist, but the artist said, "Oh, well, I dropped a tab of acid and had breakfast." And it wasn't joking. He or she wasn't joking. And the room went silent. They didn't know how to deal with this. And they didn't know if it was a joke or what. And it was no joke. It wasn't said as a funny thing. It was just being factual. So, yeah, it is a bit boring because you can't really. That's
I
what it
mean,
is. Of course, you get a few artists who live outside of the system, but not many.
speak of artists who live outside the system. You worked with the number one, didn't you, David Bowie? You must have learned so much from Bowie. I'm sure it's a cross pollination, but because he was so smart and savvy and he could read the future, it must have been fascinating to work with Bowie.
Oh, incredible. It was really, really exciting. You never knew it was unpredictable. You never knew what was coming next. I mean, the hard part was he was so switched on, you'd never know. He'd be on the phone to me, say, this is mid-90s, and like, why haven't you got everything on email? Daddy, daddy, daddy. He'd be absolutely telling me you're a Luddite. You're really dark century. So you're scrambling around to get all that. But I remember the Jeremy Paxman interview he did, which is played a lot on TV. And it was Newsnight. He didn't want to do the interview, and anyway, I got him to do it. And he talked about the birth of the internet. And I can just, in my mind's eyes now, I can see Jeremy Paxman's eyebrow going up and him looking quizzical, like, this is a load of rubbish. And David, some of the future is everything will be like, so, that. And it was so extraordinary. Actually, I'll tell you one story that comes to mind. Would be about 95-ish, I'm thinking. I'm in New York and I'm with David and Coco, and I'm staying at the Essex house. And so we're doing our normal day's program, but it gets to 6 or 7 o'clock and it's all finished. And I'm thinking, well, I'll go back to the hotel and have some food and watch some TV and go to bed. David said, could you come out with me? I've got a meeting at midnight. I need you to go. And it's a place called, and I did apple or orange or banana or something. It's apple. And I'm thinking, well, what's this all about? Anyway, we go down to Apple offices. It's down in the business district there. And it's midnight and we get to this office block and there's just a security guard. We go up to the top floor and there's a few tech guys on laptops doing stuff. And they're doing a download of his single Telling Lies. And we watch as it's actually downloaded. And I'm not very tech, so I'm not really fully thinking. And I'm watching this song goes in, and it gets picked up by about 350,000 people, and you can see it happening in real time. So in Denver, it's all happening in North America, and it's mainly college campuses. And even I have understood that within this sort of 20 minutes or something, this song has been collected by nearly 500,000 people and listened to instantaneously, as opposed to being put on trucks and motorways and distributed through shops. That was I don't know if that was the first or the second single that was ever downloaded, because I think Duran say maybe they were first, but either way. So it's just me and David and a bloke and a laptop and I think Coco. And you think, when I look back on it, you think, well, I saw the birth of modern music, if you like. So of course, another time he came to London, he wanted there was a thing called internet cafes, which was a joke. It just meant there was a couple of cafes that had a laptop and
Yeah, yeah.
there was one around the back of Tottenham Court Road and Tottenham Street, and it was called the Internet Cafe. So David was interested in going down there, and I had to get someone to talk to him. And we were going to do an internet interview on this laptop. Nobody was interested. Nobody wanted to know. And the only person I could find at short notice who happened to be on our office was Ronan Keating. I mean, how random is that? But David's interviewed by Ronan Keating in the Internet Cafe with about 3 people drinking a cup of coffee in this sort of a Tottenham Court. But of course, now you see, I mean, he was so far ahead all the time. You were learning, and then was the wallpaper he created, and then was the Bowie Bank, and then the painting. I mean, but keeping up with it. Oh my God! You know, one day he said to me, I want this single in China, distributed in China. This was like the 90s, and I don't know, how do you distribute records in China? Firstly, we had to get it put into Mandarin. I went down to Gerrard Street in Soho in Chinatown, and I got a waiter to translate the lyrics into Mandarin. I didn't tell David how I'd done this. And then he wanted distribution. And I like, so I rung up two friends of mine, Gabby Sappington and Christoph Rucker, who were at BMG International. I said, what do you do? How do I do this? And they said, well, there is no real record company system in China, but we know a bloke in Hong Kong who might import some copies for you. So anyway, I talked to them or whatever, and we get these records pressed up in vinyl and the boxes sent to this shop in Hong Kong. Now, it's supposed to be a music shop, but it's also a tailor's, and they're making suits for people. And there's these boxes, the David Bowie records with Chinese translation. David's calling me up. David was so on the detail, relentless. And he
Like
never was
Jagger in a way.
exactly like Jagger. The
Yeah.
two were like brothers. I like all great stars, especially with David. People say, what's a great star? I say, well, a great star is a great star every day of the week. It's not someone who does a tour and then goes and spends 6 months buying art or living in the Caribbean or being whatever. David Bowie was David Bowie every single day. You never knew what he was going to be on, but he was on it. It didn't matter. Christmas, Easter Day. He was oblivious to all that. He just was an artist. So anyway, back to the record shop in Hong Kong. I get a call about once a week from David saying, how's it doing in China? So I'm really having to dig deep. I said, well, they're having a distribution meeting, you know, or they're planning the strategy. And I'm thinking, it's only this old Mr. Lee in this shop who's got this box of records who don't know what to do with it, and for which there's no demand whatsoever. This goes on for 3 months, and I'm really skating on thin ice, having to sort of like, well, I think it's down the road. They're on the road to Shanghai now or whatever. And then one day, David never ever mentioned it again. And I just always wondered, did he call up the shop and speak to the bloke and find out it was a tailor's, and that box of records may still be there in Kowloon somewhere.
So your role with an artist like David Bowie is different, isn't it? It's you don't have, it's not a construct, like you say, David Bowie's David Bowie 24/7. You just have to facilitate that. You don't have to make anything up. It's already there, isn't it?
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, one day he called me up one Monday morning. He said, right, I need you to fill in for me on the board of modern painters. And this was like, I don't know if Tracy Emin was on it, but I mean, really high end, you know, people that really knew about art. And I mean, I like art, but I don't know about art in that way. I mean, I was trying to look it up and get a book from Waterstones about YBA, and then I had to go and fill in for this meeting and bluff my way through 3 hours of like high-end art and what David's position was on sort of futuristic contemporary painting, of which, you know, so it was you didn't really need to sit down and come up with a plan. Although when he did the next day, which was the penultimate album, I did for that. He called me out to New York. I went out there, and he's very modest, self-effacing guy, David. I mean, he didn't live flash. His office was a small little room, you know, down in the village, and I sat in there with him, and Coco would have been around. He played the album, you know, really good. Actually, the album wasn't called The Next Day, but that was that great single Next Day on it. And anyway, he played it to me, and he said, yeah. I said, well, when's it coming out? He said, oh, I want it out next. What did he say? He said, I want it out next Tuesday. And I thought next Tuesday, I thought I misheard him. I said, next Tuesday, what, in March? And, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
No, next week, next Tuesday. I thought, oh my God. And this was only Thursday. And he said,
Yeah.
also, he said, I need a PR marketing campaign now. Well, oh my God. So I said, well, give me a minute. And I went around the corner, went to a cafe, and I got my girlfriend Chantruma was there with me. Anyway, we went to this cafe, and I sat there, and I had no ideas. You know, just like you're like a songwriter. Sometimes nothing comes out of your head. And then I thought, well, the person that's going to buy this record is me. So what media do I consume? I said, well, I wake up early. I might hear a bit of the Today program, might watch a bit of Sky. I might see I don't know, a tweet from Tony Parsons. I might look at the music column in the time, you know, whatever. And I went through this thing, and I wrote it all down on a napkin. And I went back to the office. I said, right, I've got the plan, David. It's literally a napkin with scribbles on it. He said, okay, what is it? I said, well, he said, what do you? I've got this sort of complete blank, like a writer gets, and I'm just sitting there, nothing. I've got the pen, but nothing's coming out of my head. And then I had this sort of simple revelation. I thought, well, who's the person who's going to buy this record, David Bowie record? It's probably me. And what media do I consume? Sounds horrible, but I thought, well, I wake up early. I listen to a bit of the Today program. Then I maybe watch a bit of Kay Burley on Sky News. Then I'm checking out whatever music's in the Times, and I've glanced at Bizarre. And anyway, a whole sort of thing that I'd go to. So I thought that's the campaign. I wrote it all down. So I go back to see Dave in his office, and he said, right, well, what's the campaign? What are we going to do with radio? And I said, well, you know, you can't get Radio 1 because they're not playing anyone who's over 18. So that's out. Radio 2, you're going to get anyway. Radio 3, unless this is, you know, it's not a classical album, so don't think so. I said, Radio 4, the Today program has got an incredible reach. It's got about 7 million listeners. And importantly, everyone who runs everything in the media, whatever, in the country, in the government, they all listen to the Today program. It sets the sort of scene, and that will proliferate down. And he said, he just looked at me and he said, okay, I get it. Tick, you know, do it. And then we went through the media, and I explained, and I said, you know, we'll get it on Sky News. And then he said, there's one caveat to all this. You're not allowed to tell anybody what the project is or who it's about. I go, what? So we're talking about an album. I know, incredible. So we're talking about an album launch next week, and I'm not allowed to tell anyone what it is. I mean, to say, I seriously had a cold sweat, you know. So I go to the airport, get on the plane. I remember touching down at Heathrow. As the wheels hit the thing, I'm on the BlackBerry, as it was in those days, contacting people, and I'm being mysterious. So I call up Kay Burley at Sky, who I knew quite well. I said, Kay, you know, I've got a really big story for you, and it should be like the lead story on Tuesday. And she said, well, what is it? I said, well, I can't tell you. She said, and I remember her words now, they're in my ears. She said, stop mucking around, love, I'm busy. And basically, I said, look, the only thing I can tell you, Kay, is this person that I'm talking to you about has got shares a birthday with Elvis. Anyway, she put the phone down. 60 seconds later, because she's very sharp, Kay, she's back on the phone. She said, right, we'll do it. She's figured out Bowie, Elvis. Bowie hasn't done it for ages. It's got to be big. And she said, you've got the lead slot on the news. Then we went to the Today program, and Julian, who works with me, had a load of meetings up there, and they agreed that they were going to play the whole of the song next day. Now, they'd never played a song on the Today program ever before. It was groundbreaking. Now you hear a lot more music on you know, the Today program, but then it had never ever been done. It was like really an innovative thing. So we're getting our first play of the record, not on Radio 1, but on Radio 4 on the Today program, We've got the lead on Sky News. We've got Tony Parsons doing something somewhere. We've got the Times, and we've set it all up without actually technically telling anybody who it is. I mean, quite how we managed that, I don't really know. Talk about smoke and mirrors and inferences and suggestions. And on the day, it worked as we went. I remember seeing Eamon Holmes, who was reading the news that day on Sky, and he was like looking at it. He was like wanting to report on a war or the economy or something. He's like, why am I could see in his face, why am I reading a story about David Bowie's come back? But of course, it struck a chord with the nation. I mean, it was mentioned in Parliament later that day. Everybody, it was like a moment of cultural significance. The return of David Bowie after he'd been really in sort of exile or whatever for at least 10 years. And of course, the song the next day was so poignant and atmospheric and reflective back to Berlin, and it was melancholy and it sort of thing that we all have these moments in life where you look back and what if and what happened, and it sort of catapulted. It took David from being like really big artist, but to being a culturally iconic, significant. It took it to a different level. And I remember PR Week, who judged these things, said that they wanted to put it up for the PR awards, and I mean, we were up against British Airways campaign. And the bloke from PR Week, I don't know if it was Danny, the editor, but anyway, someone called me from PR Week. And they said, well, British Airways spent $500,000 on their adverts or whatever it was. How much did you spend on this incredible campaign? And I said, 200 quid. And they thought it was 200 grand. I said, no, 200 pounds, It was like X many phone calls and a couple of taxis or whatever.
And a napkin.
And a napkin, of course. It didn't compute. But it was an example of how really, and I go back to Malcolm, but Andrew Loog Oldham, people like this, some of the greatest campaigns are just scribbled on the back of a cigarette packet. You do not need, it's an anathema to me when you see these meetings where there's massive grids and projections and this, that, and the other. It normally means they haven't got an idea and it's a smoke screen. Ideas are really simple.
It isn't. It's like pop music itself. The idea is the kernel of everything, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, think the Beatles wrote half their songs on a bus. Marc Bolan, who I did work with early in his career, he wrote a load of his hits when he was at school under the desk during lessons. Yeah. I mean, it couldn't be much more simple than that, could it?
I guess people like Bolan, he always had it. It's like a little tap you turn on and off, isn't it? Yeah.
He was a lovely man. I did work for him quite a lot because Keith was working with the Who or whatever, and Mark's career had taken a dip at that point. So I was sort of given my initial clients working for Keith were a group called Sailor, who had a hit with a glass of champagne. It was jolly.
Great tune. Yeah.
It was a great tune. Yeah. A very nice chap. Yeah. It was one hit wonder. Hawkwind, who I was a big fan of anyway. So that was
great. Yeah.
I loved that. And Marc Bolan. And Mark was incredible. Mark was a bit like Malcolm McLaren. Everything was large in life, and he was always dramatic, and there was always a plan. And he's always like, when people say, how many number ones have you had? All the pop mags would talk to me, be like, well, I've had 80 number ones. It increased every I remember he used to turn up at the office. He wasn't doing well at that time financially or something, and he'd turn up for interviews in a Rolls Royce. And we only had our office was a little pokey place, it was like a terrace place down in Victoria. I said, how could that be? And he had a mate who ran a chauffeur company who used to meet him around the back of the office and drive him around the front in the roller. So that in front of the journalists, all pop magazines, Hello, and no, not Hello, but whatever the magazine, Jackie magazine. It was like, wow, Mark's a big star, and he'd get out of the Rolls Royce. He'd only come 100 yards in it.
It's all about the projection, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but very, very McLaren-esque.
Yeah. I mean, go back to that Bowie thing before. There was interesting you said. It was you had to imagine that you were actually the audience. I think, in a way, to me, that's another thing about the art of PR. It's not just imagining the artist and how, what their space and the thing is actually understanding the audience and what they want and how to communicate with them. Do you think that's the other second pillar of great
That's a
PR?
really important question, and it's funny. And all the times I chatted about the book, nobody's actually raised that point, and it's really, really fundamental. It's core because what I do when I'm sitting down working on a campaign, I've heard whatever the artist's got. I've listened to the music, and I get where they're at, and then I try and imagine the audience, and I try and build it as a personality. And I'll say, okay, well, they're probably female, they're probably 35 or whatever it is. I'll work out, in my mind, the demographic, and then I will work out semi-scientifically in my head and scribble what media they're going to be watching. What TV shows are they going to be looking at? The One Show? Are they going to be looking at Jules Holland? Or are they going to be? And I'll work back, and then you've got the campaign. And I'll try and do that differently every single time. Anyone who does the same campaign twice it's a mistake. And of course, your audience changes because maybe 1 minute you're in Take That, and then you're Robbie Williams, and you're a bit of a serious rock act. So the whole type of places and people you're trying to get to have changed. So each time you have to imagine the audience you're getting to separately, and then work out the media plan, because otherwise people do box tick and every campaign's the same, and that's very formulaic, and you're actually not doing your artist a real service, because they're always they may be trying to reach a certain audience. They may be trying to reach lapsed listeners, or there may be a metal band that made a folk album and want to reach a completely different audience. You never know. But you've got to be, and I found it's a good point, because one of the things that I think I've had that not all, that you don't get in a big corporate PR agency is because, I've lived it, and I still do live it. And I was always in the record shops, or I travel on the tube or whatever. I kind of have an idea of who the audience is. Now, if you're living in some great mansion and you're planning it all, pretty soon you're disconnected, and you're working on a theory rather than the reality. Even now, because I don't have a car, so I'm on buses or walking or whatever. I can feel usually where an audience, where my artist, where a record fits, and also I can feel what people really think about, because you overhear people talking about. I was at Camden Tube Station the other day, and I don't know if I mentioned, but Jack was in a band called the Magic Gang, and they played the Roundhouse last year. But I was on the tube station a couple of weeks ago, and there was a bunch of kids talking about the band. So I came into the next, I think, well, some of your fans think that, some of your fans think that.
Yeah.
But you get that sort of street intel. Yes, and of course you can get it on social media, but I also feel you get some, and if you lose touch with that, I don't think you can do proper PR.
And for different artists you work with, I guess they have different levels of this kind of connection, don't they, as well? I'm guessing that Mick Jagger was brilliant to know what the media around the world was and how the Stones should fit into that battlefield. But I'm sure he probably didn't really have much of an idea who his fans were by 1980, 81. Whereas I get the feeling Bowie probably did have both. What would that be true, or am I just assuming here?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Mick knew who his fans were technically. So, there's an apocryphal story. It's probably not that. It's probably totally true, actually. But Mick was doing a video. This would have been the 90s or something. And he thought the audience looked too old. They were doing a shoot at Shepherd's Bush. So he had a load of young kids shipped in and stood at the front. So the audience for the video were like kids and 25-year-old with T-shirts, not old geezers, So Mick did understand that, and he really made an effort. But no, he didn't have that emotional connection that David did. David actually, he knew quite a lot of the fans. It's this really strange thing, because he had that period, especially Tin Machine, and then when he was touring a lot, he didn't want to be a big star. He'd be traveling on trains and buses and stuff, and he didn't fly. So it was often more on sort of transport. And these fans would come to gigs and he'd know them by name, and you'd have a chat and he'd know where they lived and stuff. I mean, really remarkable like that. He's very,
See,
very self-effacing, as I say, sort of very much a down-to-earth, strangely, because obviously he's kind of one of the most influential star type figures, but really a very down-to-earth, normal geezer sometimes.
and then I'm looking at, say, like the Spice Girls. I think that the way that was set up was completely brilliant. The idea they were like, they're almost like the girls next door and all the little characters. I mean, how much did you have? How much was your part in creating that at all? But did that come to you as ready made, or were you kind of part of
Yeah.
creating that kind of?
No, the credit for that has to go to Simon Fuller. I think that was his vision of the sort of thing. The role I did play, and I think I could take some of the plaudits for, is building them up as individuals. So when it came to me, it was still a pop group, but having spent a bit of time with them, well, after a few days, I kind of thought, well, Mel B can fit a different demographic. And so I got Mel B to present the Mobos at the Albert Hall one year, which was like, wow. And then I can't remember, we did something completely different with Victoria, and I got them appearing and of course with Mel C, we were able to go into sports publications and this, that, and the other. So I started broadening it out so that they all developed their own, characters like the Beatles did, after the initial period. And they all had the personality and the wit to pull it off. And so I kind of represented them all as individuals as well as a group.
So this, in a sense, it was that thing of like, with Bowie, you understand who the audience is. You've
Yeah,
got 5 opportunities with the Spice Girls, 5 different
exactly,
audiences.
exactly. It was five different crowds. Victoria more to the fashion crowd, and we're trying to get her into Vogue and stuff like that. But we kind of had, and there was a girl called Caroline McAteer who worked with me at that time. We kind of, because we were sort of part of it in a weird way, and we were meeting the fans every day, and we were thinking about it day and night, and we sort of somehow instinctively knew who those audiences were. We didn't need a marketing plan. It was, it was somehow, it was in our DNA, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way they're an example of really brilliantly done PR to the point where actually their image and their styling and their audience and the way they play and connect with pop culture is more interesting than the music often. I mean, I'm not asking you to say that. That's from my end.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, I get that, and I mean, in terms of marketing, Spice Girls go down in history as one of the great marketing things in music ever, no
Mm.
question. And David and Victoria is still Posh and Becks, is still a benchmark. No footballer and pop star have created anything like it since.
Mm.
And it's obviously a global brand worth billions and zillions and whatever else. So I have people, very serious sort of, university type people, come to me and they're doing a course on this or that. So I think it will go down as it'll be down there in the PR cultural history books forever, as a as
I
a
mean,
as
obviously their relationship and they were married, etc. Of course, they're married, and there's a love thing involved in there as well. But in a sense, was it a brand? Were they very, very aware of the brand right from the start? And in a way, was it an upgrade of John and Yoko without the hard drugs?
yeah. Well, yes, it's a bit of both, because like John and Yoko, they were incredibly in love. I mean, I've been in the room with them and they just be sort of gazing into each other's eyes. So, it really was that fairy tale sort of stuff. So that was true. There was never a time at the beginning where they sat down and said, "Oh, we're going to create Posh and Becks brand." It was not like that at all. As I always say, it was made up in the back of a fag packet. And some of it, I remember going up to meet David, and he was in digs somewhere in, it might have been somewhere like Salford or something like that. He was only just breaking into the Man U team. Victoria by then was quite big with the Spice Girls, But I went to meet David, and David said, "Do you want to come back for dinner?" And I went back to his house, and it was like being in an Hovis ad, you know. I mean, it was cobbled street, and you know all the rest of it. And I always remember this thing. I've said it a few times, but he's the light. He couldn't put the lights on, and we needed to get some money for the meter. I mean, this is like how it was, you know. And dinner, he couldn't open the baked bean cans because he couldn't find a can opener. I mean, it's like, and I'm thinking, God, when's the next train back from Piccadilly to Euston? You know, really. Um, and then David said, "Oh, I've got a vision." You know, I said, "What's your, you know, what do you want to achieve?" Sort of thing, you know, PR wise. And I had worked with a few footballers. I've worked with quite a few over the years, and quite often you get, well, I want to get some clothes from, you know, such and such a shop, or I want to meet some girl, or I want, you know, whatever. And David said, "Oh yeah, yeah, and you know, got a vision." I said, "Okay, what is it?" He said, "Well, I want to do everything I can to battle against racism in soccer. I'm very, very keen on women's soccer. I want to see that built in America. I want to see soccer taken to America." And I'm sitting there, right? I am actually writing it. I don't know if we had post-it notes then, but wherever it was, I'm, I can't believe this. I mean, it's like, this is not like any football I've met before. And he had a whole vision stretching forward. And it was, I mean, it was like a light bulb for me. I thought, I'm sitting in the presence of greatness in one way, shape, you know, one way or another. Um, so David had this real idea, and he was really, I remember he's doing his first photo shoot. He did an interview with a scribe, but then his first photo shoot, I think we'd got him in Sunday Times Style. And he was really detailed about it. He said, "I want to wear this kind of a jacket. The stitching's got to be like this. I want to do an Elvis type look with my quick." I'm thinking, I've never met, most pop stars are not got that
Yeah.
attention that David Bowie would, but hardly any pop stars, let alone a footballer at that in that era. I mean, he was so far ahead. And then, of course, Victoria couldn't have been more switched on with Spice Girls. So you put the two things together, and it becomes this explosion. This thing. But it was not a written plan. It was not devised in some agency somewhere.
It's interesting because he doesn't really come over like that, does he? He comes over as, I mean, he's quite a quiet guy. I mean, I never met
Yeah.
him, but see him telling that. So he's quite visionary, and he's happy to not be seen as a visionary as well. He likes to sit in a weird way. If you're doing PR, this is quite odd, isn't it? He likes to not have the story.
Yeah, it's weird. You could say he plays it down, really.
Mm.
I mean, I used to say to people, I'd go to press people, and I'd say, "Well, I think David Beckham's a genius," and they would literally derisory. They'd laugh at me because they'd like listen to how he talked. Now, he was not. He hadn't been to university, and it was like, you know, he spoke quite simply. But I'd say, no, no, he's really clever. It's just because he's not totally articulate doesn't mean he's not brilliant. I mean, this is,
Mm.
you know, this is very common actually. And I said, look at it in a footballing terms. This guy can project a ball, kick a ball 60 yards and land it within a few inches. I'm telling you that there's a mathematical genius to this, you know. And people took piss out of me about it. Anyway, one day I'm coming back from Old Trafford, and I get a lift as an evening game, and his mum gives me a lift back. His mum's very lovely, and it's just a very normal car. I mean, normal, like it goes about 10 miles an hour. So it takes about 8 hours to get back to London, you know. So we talked a lot, and she was talking about David at school, and she said he didn't care about school, he just wanted to play football. But she said he was incredible with mathematics. He could do any equation or calculation just like that, just instantly. He knew how to do it. And I thought, wow, that absolutely proves this little theory I've had about the way his mind and eye works in terms of kicking the ball. And then about a year later, I saw a piece, I think it was in the Sunday Times, and there was some professor of sport or something actually saying the whole thing that Beckham was a genius. And I thought, fantastic. Finally, unfortunately, I didn't get any credit for the piece because it came later. But so, genius or brilliance is often, these are misused phrases, aren't they? People sort of,
Mm.
base it on, well, how much education have you got, or this, that, and the other, you know. There are other ways, as we know, with musicians. I mean, clearly, John
Mm.
Lennon was a genius of sorts, but, I'm sure he hadn't read any hadn't read any of the classics or anything. Does you know? So there's different ways of looking at it.
I guess as a PR working in pop culture, this is a constant battle, isn't it? Because people in pop culture and sports people are considered to be stupid, aren't they? And because they haven't gone to the right schools and colleges, which is a very British thing, isn't it?
Of course. And that was the whole, really, if you think about it, the wave, with the Beatles, Stones, Zeppelin, Who, they were all, none of them have been to university, and people didn't go to university in those days. The best, they might have gone to an art college or something, I don't know, Jimmy Page or whatever, but really they'd come out of school, like David was, out of school by 16 or 15, hanging out with Marc Bolan out the window in Carnaby Street. But they had brilliance in them. It just wasn't obvious, or it wasn't that it wasn't obvious. It was that it didn't fit the establishment sort of understanding of what genius was. And then the same with punk. You'll know, like I do, there was a lot of very clever people in punk. All of them actually, from Lydon to Malcolm to Joe Strump. I mean, these were not sort of yobbos or something, as they were sometimes portrayed. And there was a movement, and there was a meaning behind it, and there was a sort of, there was a lot of creative thought and ideas going on. So yes, you're dead right. In pop culture, all the time, you're trying to break down those barriers. Same as Spice Girls, really. Oh, they're just a pop group. No, they're not. They have a greater significance. And then you get into girl power and how that the amount of women that I know that will tell you that they were a girl growing up with it, and how, sporty or scary empowered them.
Different ways to be a girl. Yeah. So
So
bringing it all up to date now, the people you work with now, I find Yungblud quite fascinating. So do you bring stuff, when you speak to a guy like that, or people equivalent to him, do you bring all those decades of experience in, or do you look at this, it's a completely different popscape now, there's different ways of dealing with it, or is it a mixture of the two?
Well, I would, it is a mixture of the two, but I mean, I would say sometimes someone who's not really got a vision, they don't really understand the history. And it could be a bit boring or disappointing, because you think, I'm only giving you 5% of my knowledge, and all right, if that's all you want, I can do it, but I can bring a lot more to this. Yungblud, he found me, and he's a real historian's not the right word, but he really gets legacy, and he really understands, and British rock in particular. And there's not much he doesn't know about Bowie, Stones, Who, Zeppelin. And he was like asking me, well, how did they do this? How did David do that? What was the Lou Goldham thing with the Stones? So, I mean, when you've got a creative, intelligent mind like that, and that kind of ambition, fantastic. I mean, I was so excited to work with him. And then now he's just made a double album. I mean, this is not a guy who's going to go the normal path. And he's doing Bloodfest again. To me, and he will, at some point, he'll become a sort of superstar, like Bowie will go from this to that level. But working with people like that it brings out all the creative juices, and they really respect and want to know that. But yeah, not always, I suppose.
Is he trapped then? It's great he knows about the past and he's learned from the past, but not to be trapped by the past. And do you find that as well with the way you approach campaigns? Yeah, there's great trying to test a way of doing it, but we have to think like Bowie. We have to keep thinking about the future, don't we?
Yeah, well, that's why he was talking about doing a double album. He said, well, everyone was telling me I can't do it. So I decided and I went away and decided, fuck it, I'm doing it, type of thing. So you have to, he's not nostalgic. He's not there sort of like, it's like, he's what can I learn? What bits can I take out of it and apply to what I'm doing now? That's the skill. So it's not just sort of looking back, it's learning like we all do. I mean, I try to learn from great writers or great, like I've talked about Lou Goldham or McLaren, it doesn't mean I want to be them, but, they did it this way, they did it, or Alistair Campbell, all kinds of people. And if you're doing it, you're learning every day. I mean, I look at something like, you look at American politics and that last election, and there's a lot for PR to learn about that. Whatever you think about the politics, the communication skills and methods really fascinating. And if you're not switched on and absorbing from it, then you're not moving forward.
Yeah, it seemed like the people with the wrong ideas are the best way of getting them over.
Yeah, I mean, look, whatever, it's not a political forum, this, is it? But you can't deny that Trump's a fantastic communicator.
He got through to the people who voted, which the
Yeah.
Democrats, which all around the world that story happens, doesn't it? So, all right,
Yeah.
well, Alan, that's brilliant. Well, thanks for your time. Really appreciate that.
It was a really invigorating chat. And there's a couple of great questions that no one's